As an instrument pilot, do you know the rules about starting an approach at a waypoint marked as an IF/IAF? And if there's a racetrack depicted at the IF/IAF, do you know when you're required to fly the hold to start the approach and when you can skip the hold? Today we'll talk about a Cirrus SR22 accident that occurred at Paso Robles, California this past weekend that involved a pilot flying just this kind of an approach. And we'll tell you what you need to remember when starting an approach from an IF/IAF. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk in general aviation. My name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. Last week in Part 2, we talked about ways to build flight time by working in Part 91 in corporate flying jobs, flying air tours, banner tow, glider tow, as a CFI, and through time building programs. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/324. And if you're new to the show, welcome. Great to have you here. If you would now take a moment and touch either the subscribe key, or if you're using the Apple Podcast app, the follow key, so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. But first, let me remind you that this is a listener-supported show supported by, people just like you listening right now. And we have several new ways you can show your love and support for the show. Just go on out to our new support page at aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you'll find links to support the show via PayPal, Venmo, Zelle, or Patreon. And when you make a donation, I'll read your name on the show. Now, this is a bonus episode focused on just one accident that occurred over the weekend because it's an important one, and I want to share my thoughts about it with you. I expect we'll have our regular news show later in the week. Now let's talk about the crash of November 51 Foxtrot Mike, a 2020 SR22 that crashed next to the runway at Paso Robles Airport, that's PRB, on Friday morning. The aircraft flipped over and came to rest upside down. Miraculously, the pilot and two passengers survived. One of the people on board was hospitalized in stable condition, and the two others were treated at the scene. At 11:24 a.m., the Paso Robles Fire and Emergency Services responded to a report of an aircraft off the runway. When firefighters arrived, they found the plane 300 feet off the runway, resting upside down, with three people inside who needed help getting out. One of the owners of the plane, who was not on board, is a pilot for one of the major airlines, and he said in a social media post, quote, "The only thing I care about is that everyone walked away. I thank God for his protection of my family and friends. It could have been much worse." Yes, it certainly could have been. Like many accidents, there was more than one mistake which led to the accident. By my count, there were three major mistakes. And if any of these mistakes had been avoided, we wouldn't be talking about this accident. And I've certainly made at least one of these mistakes when I was a low-time pilot, and you probably have as well. Let's walk through the pilot's day and the mistakes that were made. Like many accidents, we have ADS-B data for the flight, but unlike some accidents, we have ADS-B data for the aircraft all the way to the ground to its final resting place. So we have a clear picture of what took place at every step along the way. The day started in Scottsdale, Arizona. The plane took off at 6:49 a.m. local time. It climbed to 10,500 feet and flew for about an hour and 45 minutes to L35 in Big Bear, California. Now this is where we note the first anomaly of the day. The aircraft passed overhead the airport at a little over 10,000 feet. Field elevation at Big Bear is 5,850 feet, so the aircraft was a little over 4,000 feet above the airport. The aircraft then descended into right traffic to runway 26, but left traffic is standard at Big Bear for runway 26. On downwind, the aircraft had a ground speed of 142 to 152 knots while descending to about 8,600 feet. Now the Cirrus SOP is that once you pass the numbers on downwind, you should be at 100 knots. On base, this aircraft was at 140 knots, passing through 8,400 feet. The Cirrus standard, however, is that the plane is to be flown at 90 knots on base, so this aircraft was about 50 knots fast. It turned final at 138 knots at 7,450 feet, descending at about 500 to 600 feet per minute. On final, Cirrus says to fly the aircraft at about 80 knots, though in some aircraft the VREF will be a few knots higher. On final, the aircraft slowed to 124 knots at 7,500 feet, 112 knots at 7,150 feet, and 99 knots at 6,800 feet. So in addition to not flying the required left traffic pattern, the approach speeds were much higher than the Cirrus SOPs. The aircraft was on the ground for about 90 minutes and took off at about 10 a.m. It flew directly toward Paso Robles at 10,500 feet. At about 10:55 a.m., it began a descent to 8,000 feet as it had picked up an IFR clearance to Paso Robles. Later, it was cleared direct to Hovli, that's H-O-V-L-I, which is a combined IF/IAF with a racetrack for the RNAV GPS-19 approach into Paso Robles. The field elevation at Paso Robles is 838 feet. Weather around the time of the accident was reported as winds calm, visibility 10 miles, overcast at 1,000 feet, temperature 14, dew point 11, altimeter 29.99. So the clouds were at approximately 1,800 feet MSL. Straight-in minimums for the RNAV GPS-19 approach are 1,062 feet or 250 feet AGL for all categories with 3/4 mile visibility. So with the clouds at 1,800 feet or 1,000 feet AGL, the pilot had an excellent chance of completing this approach if it were flown correctly, which it was not. In a moment, I'll play you the clearance the pilot was given. But first, let's talk about how to start an instrument approach from an IF/IAF, such as Hovli. Now, let me read now from my Max Trescott's G1000 Glass Cockpit Handbook. And you do have a copy of it, don't you? If not, I'll tell you later how to get one. I'm going to change the wording slightly to reference the fix Hovli that this pilot was cleared to, rather than the different fix referenced in my book. Quote, all instrument approaches have an initial approach segment that begins at an initial approach fix or IAF and ends where it joins the intermediate approach segment at the intermediate fix or IF. You can start an approach at the IF if a racetrack holding pattern is depicted and the fix is labeled IAF or IF/IAF. The racetrack holding pattern is for a course reversal and altitude adjustment when starting the procedure at this fix. To begin the approach, first navigate directly to Hovli, cross the fix, and first fly away from the airport. Then turn to reverse direction and cross Hovli a second time. There are no requirements as to how you accomplish the 180-degree turn, except that all turns must be on the side of the course depicted by the racetrack symbol on the chart. Prior to 2006, all instrument approaches starting at an IF/IAF with a racetrack were required to fly the course reversal. Now, however, pilots can navigate directly to an IF and skip the depicted course reversal if they approach the IF from a direction from which they can turn to final with less than a 90-degree turn. At Paso Robles, aircraft flying directly to Hovli on a course of 104 degrees through 284 degrees can skip the course reversal. Alternatively, we could ask ATC to vector us to a position from where we can be cleared to fly direct to Hovli and skip the hold in lieu of a procedure turn. Unfortunately, the accident aircraft was on a course of about 314 degrees to Hovli, which meant that skipping the hold and turning directly onto the final approach from Hovli would require a turn of greater than 90 degrees. Hence, the controller couldn't legally authorize the aircraft to turn straight onto the approach from Hovli. The aircraft was, in fact, required to fly a hold in lieu of procedure turn, or HILPT, in the holding pattern at Hovli. An HILPT is a course reversal that uses the same entry techniques you would use for entering a hold. In this case, the pilot needed to cross Hovli, which she did, and then enter the hold using normal entry techniques. Then when crossing Hovli the second time, the pilot is permitted to turn onto the final approach course. The holding pattern can also be used by a pilot to descend to an altitude that will permit a normal descent to the final approach fix altitude. In this case, if you cross Hovli at an altitude that's much higher than the first leg of the approach, you really need the time on the hold to descend so that you won't be too high when you turn inbound for the approach. To fly the approach properly, the aircraft had to cross Hovli twice, once as it entered the hold, and a second time as it completed the hold, at which time it could then turn onto the final approach course. By contrast, if the aircraft had been coming into Hovli from a direction that would allow a turn onto final with a less than 90-degree turn, the controller could have authorized this pilot to skip the hold and proceed straight in. And a clearance of that type would have used the phrase cleared for the straight-in RNAV 19 approach, with the phrase straight in meaning that the pilot is not permitted to fly the hold and must turn straight onto the approach from Hovli. Here's an audio clip of the pilot checking in with Oakland Center and receiving a clearance. And this and all audio clips we'll play today are courtesy of liveatc.net.
Oakland Center, Cirrus 51 Foxtrot Mike with you 8000. November 5-1, Foxtrot Mike, Oakland Center, Paso Robles altimeter 2999. You can expect holding, and what's your approach request?
2999, approach request for runway 191 Foxtrot Mike.
Okay, November 5-1, Foxtrot Mike, you're cleared to the Paso Robles Airport via Hobley, and the remainder of the RNAV runway 19er approach. Maintain 8,000, you can expect hospital.
Continue to Paso Robles, direct Hobley for the 19, maintain 8,000, 1 Foxtrot Mike.
So the pilot had an IFR clearance and was told to expect holding. Now, if you were this pilot and told to expect holding, would you infer that that was because A, there was traffic congestion and you needed to wait in the hold until a controller could fit you in for the approach, or B, that the direction from which you were approaching Hobley required that you enter the hold? For sure, B was true. This pilot was required to fly the hold because she was approaching Hobley from a direction that requires that the hold be flown. But it may have also been true that A, there was traffic congestion and there would be a wait for the controller to fit the aircraft in for the approach. In fact, this controller was extremely busy handling many aircraft, including multiple aircraft that wanted to fly the approach into Paso Robles and an exec jet pilot on the ground at Paso Robles who wanted to depart IFR. So if you're a pilot who's not really clear on the rules on when you're required to fly the holding pattern at an IAF/IAF, would it have been easy to get confused by this conversation? Absolutely. But as instrument pilots, we're supposed to know these rules. And this is really important. If you're ever confused, you must speak up and ask the controller for clarification. That's your responsibility as a pilot. You're not allowed to remain confused. You must take the role of PIC seriously, which means that you're fully aware of what you're supposed to do at all times. Later, Oakland Center cleared the pilot to 7,000 feet, and then about 6 minutes later, we heard this conversation.
November 5-1, Foxtrot Mike, enter the published hold at Hobley, maintain 7,000. You can expect further clearance at 1820.
Published hold at Hobley, maintain 7,000, except for the clearance, 1 Foxtrot Mike.
And 1 Foxtrot Mike, you should have that approach clearance before you even enter the hold.
Sounds good, thank you, 1 Foxtrot Mike.
Did you notice the enthusiasm in the pilot's voice when she heard that she'd get her clearance before the hold? And she responded, "Sounds good." She sounded really happy. Now, I can think of two possible interpretations a pilot might have after being told that they might get their clearance before the hold. One interpretation is, A, if I get my clearance before the hold, I won't have to fly the hold. And B, I may get my clearance before I enter the hold, but I still have to fly the hold as required when starting at an IF/IAF from the direction from which I'm coming. Now, which interpretation would excite a pilot more? Yes, I would be excited to not have to fly a hold, but it would make no difference to me at all whether I got a clearance before or after entering a hold if I still had to fly the hold. So I think it's likely from the enthusiastic response from this pilot that she believed, A, if I get my clearance before the hold, I won't have to fly the hold. About a minute later, just a few seconds after the pilot crossed Hobley, this conversation occurred.
7-1 Foxtrot Mike, are you established in the hold at descent?
Getting established in the hold for at 7,000, Hobley, 1 Foxtrot Mike.
November 5-1 Foxtrot Mike, roger. Descend and maintain 5,000, and you're cleared RNAV runway 19 approach into Paso Robles.
I maintain 5,000, cleared for the approach 19 into Paso Robles, 1 Foxtrot Mike.
The pilot is now cleared to fly the approach, and as we know, she was required to fly the hold. Here's some important information from the RNAV GPS 19 approach chart. The minimum altitude permitted for crossing Hobley inbound onto the approach is 4,400 feet. The next fix is Wugop, which is 3.7 miles away toward the airport, and its minimum crossing altitude is 3,400 feet. The pilot crossed Hobley at 7,000 feet, and moments later was cleared for the approach. At that moment, she was 2,600 feet above the minimum crossing altitude for Hobley. Now, here comes the brief lecture. As an instrument pilot, during the descent and as you approach the beginning of an instrument approach, you must be constantly aware of your current altitude and the altitude that you need to be at in the near future, because airplanes are not helicopters. It takes time and distance to get down. You can't just hover in place and drop down a few thousand feet. In fact, that's not a good idea for a helicopter either. As an instrument pilot, you have to think about what altitude you need to be at when you start an approach. And most of the time, starting an approach 2,600 feet high is not going to work out, unless perhaps it's at the IAF for a really long approach. But in this case, the pilot was 2,600 feet high, not at the IAF, but at the IF. So it was absolutely essential that she descend in the hold and lose a few thousand feet before turning inbound on the approach. If you look at the chart, you'll see that once in the holding pattern and cleared for the approach, a pilot can descend all the way to 4,400 feet, which is, not coincidentally, also the minimum crossing altitude for crossing Havli when inbound on the approach. So even though the controller said descend to 5,000 feet, the pilot was authorized to descend all the way down to 4,400 feet because she had crossed Havli into the holding pattern and was cleared for the approach. So I'm sure you figured out from what I've said that this pilot did not fly the holding pattern as required. She was almost at Havli as the controller called, and she had just crossed Havli when she said she was getting established in the hold. After being cleared for the approach, she started a descent. Note that Havli was now about 20 seconds behind her. Instead of continuing to enter the hold, she made a left turn of about 150 degrees, so not quite a 180-degree turn, and aimed roughly at Wugop, the next fix beyond Havli. During this turn and the descent, the aircraft reached a ground speed of 208 knots, equal to the VNE, or never exceed speed for this aircraft, of 208 knots. Note that Cirrus says that you should approach an IAF at 120 knots, and then once you're established on an instrument approach, you should fly it at 100 knots. The pilot joined the approach at Wugop, essentially missing the intermediate segment from Havli to Wugop, and crossed Wugop at 5,000 feet or 1,600 feet above the 3,400-foot crossing altitude. The pilot then flew halfway to the next fix, Jerbu, before starting a descent from 5,000 feet. The aircraft crossed Jerbu at 4,800 feet or 2,100 feet high while descending at 750 feet per minute at 134 knots. The aircraft then crossed Wairuk at 4,000 feet versus 2,000 feet, so 2,000 feet high, while descending at 830 feet per minute at 143 knots. And at this point, the pilot made an announcement on the CTAF.
Paso Robles traffic, Cirrus 51 Foxtrot Mike is on the final approach for runway 19. And we're going to be full stop, Paso Robles.
34 seconds later, the aircraft reached 3,400 feet while descending at 2,050 feet per minute at 154 knots. The aircraft continued to descend, reaching a peak speed of 170 knots and a peak descent rate of 2,300 feet per minute. The aircraft crossed the runway threshold at about 1,700 feet at 147 knots while still descending at 1,100 feet per minute. The aircraft at this point would have been about 100 feet below the clouds. Now, to be blunt, this was the epitome of an unstable approach. You might think that the pilot continued to try to land, resulting in the crash, but at this point the pilot showed good judgment. A couple of seconds after crossing the threshold, she made this announcement.
Paso Robles traffic, Cirrus 51 Foxtrot Mike is going to go around, make right traffic into 19 with Foxtrot Mike.
She continued to fly down the length of the runway while slowing to 120 knots and leveling off at about 1,300 feet, which is the circling MDA for this approach. And to her credit, she stayed relatively close to 1,300 feet, as required in the circle, and didn't go below that altitude until later when she was in a position to land on the runway. After flying down the length of the runway, she turned about 150 degrees to the right on a heading of about 340. After completing that turn, she went back to Oakland Center and made this call.
Oakland Center, Cirrus 51 Foxtrot Mike. Just one miss on the approach. Wondering if we can circle back into runway 19.
51 Foxtrot Mike, take it.
Oakland Center, Cirrus 51 Foxtrot Mike. Just one missed off of the 19 approach. Wondering if we can just get the visual back into 19.
You're requesting the visual approach?
Correct, 1 Foxtrot Mike.
51 Foxtrot Mike, Roger, you cleared visual approach Paso Robles Airport, and again, report cancellation of IFR on this frequency or flight service.
I'll cancel with you, 1 Foxtrot Mike, thank you.
Now, this is a very minor point that I'm going to mention. The pilot said, "We went missed," but didn't in fact follow the published missed procedure, which would have been a climbing left turn. In fact, the pilot turned right as she was looking to convert this straight-in approach to a circling approach. She first asked for a clearance to circle and then asked for a visual approach, which the controller approved. And here's an interesting point. Why was the pilot required to contact Oakland to circle back to runway 19? Give up? Actually, she wasn't required to contact the controller at all, so the time spent switching radios and contacting Oakland Center was totally wasted. In fact, during this time, the pilot ended up flying about 2.5 miles from the airport, which placed the aircraft outside the 1.8-mile distance for circling in Category B with an MDA between 1,000 and 3,000 feet MSL. And just a reminder, in 2013, the FAA changed the distances for each category when circling. Now here's a subtle point about circling approaches, and this comes from the FAA's 7110.65, the Controller Handbook. In Section 4-8-6, Circling Approach, it says, A. Circling approach instructions may only be given for aircraft landing at airports with operational control towers. So, in fact, you can't get a clearance to circle at a non-towered airport such as Paso Robles. So a clearance for an approach to a non-towered airport is implicitly a clearance to land on any authorized runway at the completion of that approach, and that includes circling to another runway. The aircraft then turned about 90 degrees right to a heading of about 060 and made this final announcement.
Paso Robles traffic, Cirrus 51 Foxtrot Mike is coming down in for the base for runway 19 full stop, Paso Robles traffic.
Note that this aircraft, now on a base leg, supposedly for runway 19, had sped up to 142 knots, 50 knots faster than the standard Cirrus speed of 90 knots for a base leg. The aircraft then turned about 90 degrees to the right, lining up not for runway 19 as announced, but for runway 13. Interestingly, ADS-B data shows that the aircraft's heading bug was still set for 195 degrees where it had been set throughout the approach. Now, heading bugs are a wonderful way to double-check whether you're on the proper headings for downwind, base, and final. But this pilot overlooked that the heading bug she set for runway 19 was about 60 degrees off her heading as she turned final for runway 13. So lining up for the wrong runway was the second major mistake, the first one being that the aircraft did not fly the required holding procedure. The aircraft slowed appropriately on final, and when it was about 100 feet off the ground, still lined up for runway 13, it was at 79 knots, which is a perfect approach speed for this aircraft. So in spite of the difficulties in getting to this point, the aircraft was finally now in a stable approach to land, albeit on runway 13 instead of runway 19. Now the pilot had a decision to make. What three choices can you think of? Two of the choices are reasonable. The first would be to continue to land on runway 13. After all, the aircraft was all set up to land on that runway. Questions that might reasonably have been going through the pilot's mind might have been, do I know how long this runway is? It is shorter than runway 19, but how much shorter? The pilot also might wonder if there are any other aircraft using that runway and be reluctant to land on 13, especially after having announced a plan to land on 19. We don't know the reason why, but this pilot apparently didn't exercise the option to land on 13. Another excellent option would have been to go around. That would take away all of the questions about runway 13 and allow the pilot to fly the pattern again and land on runway 19. But unfortunately, the pilot didn't choose that option either. It appears, though we can't be sure, that the pilot chose a third option, which was to turn at low altitude, 60 degrees to the right to join runway 19. Let me describe the layout of the field at Paso Robles. Technically, runways 19 and 13 don't intersect each other, though they come very close to doing so. When you're on short final to runway 13, you'll first cross over runway 19. As you continue, you'll fly over 3 chevrons for runway 13, and then reach the threshold for runway 13. So to land on 13, you'd first fly over runway 19, cross over a very short section of pavement that connects 19 with the threshold of runway 13, and then land on runway 13. When the aircraft was about 100 feet AGL, just as it was about to start crossing over runway 19, the aircraft turned about 20 degrees to the right. But you would have had to turn about 60 degrees to the right to join runway 19. So this aircraft turned away from runway 13, but didn't turn nearly enough to line up with runway 19. It was about 50 feet AGL as it crossed runway 19, and then it landed in the grass between runway 19 and 13 and flipped over. Now, the pilot and passengers were incredibly lucky. A significant percentage of Cirrus landing accidents are fatal because of the higher landing speeds. That all 3 pilots on board survived is miraculous. So the third major mistake in this accident sequence was that the pilot failed to go around or land on 1-3 when she realized that she had lined up with the wrong runway. A good question for all of us to consider is what human factors might prevent us from making a good decision to do a second go-around, especially if we have passengers or family members on board. I took a human factors course at USC a few weeks ago, and here are a few factors that can come to play in a situation such as that. 1, pressure to complete the flight. Pilots may feel pressure either internally or externally to complete a flight as scheduled. This could be due to factors such as passenger expectations, deadlines, or personal motivations. The presence of family members aboard may amplify this pressure, as a pilot may feel a heightened sense of responsibility for their safety and well-being. 2, risk perception. The pilot's perception of risk may be distorted due to various factors, such as fatigue, stress, or familiarity bias. And by the way, this plane had been to Paso Robles a number of times in the past year. In this scenario, the pilot may underestimate the risk associated with attempting a flawed landing and overestimate their ability to successfully complete it. Number 3, overconfidence. Pilots, like individuals in other high-stakes professions, can sometimes suffer from overconfidence bias. The pilot may believe that they can salvage the landing despite the initial mistake, leading them to underestimate the need for a go-around. 4, decision fatigue. After a series of stressful events, such as the first improper approach and subsequent go-around, the pilot's ability to make sound decisions may be impaired due to decision fatigue. This could result in a decreased willingness to initiate another go-around, even if it was the safest course of action. 5, social facilitation. The presence of family members or friends aboard may create a social facilitation effect where the pilot feels a subconscious urge to perform well in front of them. This desire to impress or reassure loved ones may influence a pilot's decision-making and lead them to take unnecessary risks to avoid disappointment or concern from family members and friends. 6, normalization of deviance. If the pilot has previously experienced similar situations where flawed landings were successfully completed without incident, they may become desensitized to the risk associated with such actions. The normalization of deviance can lead to complacency and a reluctance to deviate from established routines or procedures. And finally, 7, loss aversion. A pilot may experience a psychological aversion to the idea of losing by initiating a second go-around. This could stem from a fear of embarrassment, self-doubt, or a desire to avoid admitting failure. Instead of accepting the need for a go-around, a pilot may be driven by a subconscious desire to salvage the landing at all cost. So as you can see, a combination of factors can influence a pilot to continue with a flawed landing rather than execute a second go-around, particularly when family or friends are aboard. And these psychological factors underscore the importance of robust training and a strong orientation towards safety and especially toward mitigating risks. Now, part of the reason that I play the go-around song at the end of every episode is that I want you to remember that you can always go around at any time. And having to go around isn't a negative reflection on your piloting skills. On the contrary, it's a positive affirmation of your superior decision-making skills when you do choose to go around. Remember, as GA pilots, we're doing the hardest flying with the heaviest workload with the fewest cockpit resources compared to pilots who fly with 2-pilot crews for Part 135 of the airlines. So we need to build even more margin into everything we do because as a single pilot, it's all on our shoulders. There's no one there to help us with those decisions. So when you're flying and the hair starts to rise on the back of your neck, or you start to get that queasy feeling in your stomach, or your senses say, hey, something isn't quite right, just go around. And then later, as you reflect on what led you to go around, pat yourself on the back for having made a good decision that saved you from whatever situation you found yourself in. And please train, and hopefully with a CFI. And in your spare time, read so that you're familiar with all the regulations, including when you need to fly the hold at an IAF/IAF. And we'll be back in a moment, but first let me ask you, are you flying an airplane equipped with the Garmin G1000 Perspective or the G3000 or G5000? If so, do you know everything there is to know about the system and its autopilot? I'm sure you've read the POH for your airplane from cover to cover, but have you done that for your avionics? Even if you know a lot about the G1000 or G3000 and the autopilot, there's probably more to learn, and you certainly don't want to be struggling to figure out the nuances of the system as you're flying in the clouds. People who've read my books tell me they are much easier to read than the Garmin manuals, plus they have a great index, so it's easy to look up any feature you're trying to figure out. To truly master a plane, you have to also master the avionics. So call to get my Max Truscotts G1000 and Perspective Glass Cockpit Handbook or my Max Truscotts G3000 and G5000 Glass Cockpit Handbook. The former is $34.95 and the latter is $44.95. Commit to doing that now and call 800-247-6553 to order. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. And of course, I also want to thank everyone who supports the show in one of the following ways. We love it when you join the club and sign up at aviationnewstalk.com/support to support the show financially. You can also do that at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You